Hello and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at.
You can't have a contest if you see politics as an all-out war instead of a peaceful way.
A terrorism specialist on the threats to democracy 3 years after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. A ban on extremist police officers is set to go into effect in Chicago. Our Spotlight Politics has a preview on that and much more.
There's an implicit threat that your car will pay the price.
And we dig into Dibs, a look at the madness and merriment of Chicago's parking spot saving tradition. And now to some of today's top stories. We're now learning why Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was hospitalized in late December. The Pentagon says Austin was being treated for prostate cancer through a minimally invasive surgical procedure.
He was under general anesthesia during this procedure. Secretary Austin recovered uneventfully from his surgery and returned home the next morning. His prostate cancer was detected early and his prognosis is excellent.
Days later, Austin was readmitted to the hospital with a urinary tract infection. Austin has been under criticism since neither the White House nor the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who'd assumed his duties, were aware of the hospitalization until 3 days after he was admitted. The White House says it's taking a look at processes across the administration to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. Chicago Public Schools has lost more than 77,000 electronic devices worth $23 million. CPS Inspector General Will Fletcher says the devices, like iPads and tablets, mostly issued to students during remote learning and the pandemic, often weren't returned with little consequence. In some cases, schools reported 100% of the equipment as lost or stolen, with some students not returning multiple devices they had been issued. Fletcher's office made 16 recommendations to the district, including rewriting its inventory management policy. You can read the full report on our website. As the race to become the next Cook County State's attorney picks up speed, the current office holder is reflecting on her record and future. Kim Fox spoke with faith and community leaders on the city's west side and addressed the frequent criticism that Chicago's crime and violence rates are a reflection of how many and which crimes her office prosecutes.
I'm going to keep it plain because I'm tired. I'm tired of false conversations about crime and violence and what keeps us safe, and this notion that one singular individual in a role in an office is what's going to change it when we in this room know what it is.
Last year, Fox announced she won't be running for a third term. 2 Democrats and 1 Republican have filed to run for the office. The Illinois primary election is on March 19th. And if you can work from home tomorrow, it might be a good idea. The National Weather Service in Chicago says rain and snow will lead to a slow and slippery Tuesday morning commute. Any rain moving in later tonight will quickly change to snow in the Chicago metro area. If you haven't looked out your window, it may be snowing now. Then tomorrow it'll be cold and blustery with an additional 1 to 2 inches of snow expected. Up next, assessing the dangers to American democracy in 2024, right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Saturday marked the 3rd anniversary of the assault on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of former President Donald Trump. With Trump the overwhelming favorite to get the Republican nomination once again, President Joe Biden is beginning to focus his attacks on his presumed opponent. In a speech Friday from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, Biden portrayed Trump as an existential threat to American democracy and made clear that in his mind, the electoral stakes could not be higher.
This is not rhetorical, academic, or hypothetical. Whether democracy is still America's sacred cause is the most urgent question of our time. And it's what the 2024 election is all about.
Joining us now with more is Robert Pate, political science professor at the University of Chicago, terrorism specialist, and the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Robert, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, since the attacks on the Capitol, you and your team, you all have been working to track the threat of domestic political violence through your Dangerous to Democracy survey. How would you assess the level of the threat today, and what's been the trend?
We are a tinderbox of a country. There are literally millions and millions of Americans who are willing to use force, say they're willing to use force, and support the use of force to achieve political goals if they can't achieve them through the ballot box. That is a really striking phenomenon. There's a large group on the right, you can call them the MAGA, the violent MAGA right, and the problem with the right isn't just these violent sentiments on the right, it's that there's a leader, Donald Trump himself, who's demonstrated a unique willingness and capacity to mobilize large folks in the mainstream to support the use of violence for his goals.
Go ahead.
There are similar, I would say, sentiments on the left. We have millions of Americans who are violently opposed to the return of Donald Trump, who are violently in favor of restoring abortion rights. But we don't have a similar leader on the left that's actually stoking those flames, encouraging that violence. And so, although we are a tinderbox of a country, the main problems we're facing over the next, say, 12 months are likely going to be on the right.
You say that this is a striking phenomenon. Is this level of, support for political violence, actual violence? You say folks they admit to being willing to use force. Were those same folks kind of quiet about their willingness to use force once upon a time, and now it's okay to say out loud?
What I've been, for 30 years, I have studied political violence around the world. What's striking is the mainstream nature of the support for political violence in the United States. And this starts with January 6th. On January 6th, we now have over 1,100 people who have been prosecuted for crimes related to January 6th. Nearly 50% of those individuals are doctors, lawyers, architects. They are business owners. They're executives in corporations including in Schaumburg here, or basically middle-class folks in Elmhurst here in Chicago. What's really striking is that we're seeing the support for violence in the mainstream and even among affluent segments of the country, and that is not something that's normal. Normally, we would expect violence to be with folks who might think have very little to lose. These folks have a lot to lose.
Well, and you argue, that there's been a lot of focus on the fringe elements, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the like. But you say that is not the complete picture. And as you just referenced, your research tells you more about the types of people who were at the Capitol committing that assault. 3
years ago, it was very easy for the news media to focus on the QAnon shaman. It was very easy to focus on a Oath Keeper or a Proud Boy. Some of them were actually wearing kind of uniforms, so you could actually pick them out. What we have learned in the last 3 years is that that was actually the minor part of the insurrection. Only 12% of the individuals who invaded the Capitol on January 6th were members of the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. Nearly 90% were not. They were Trump supporters, basically ordinary Trump supporters coming from across the country, and mostly from urban areas or suburban areas, not from rural America. So we tend to think, if I could put it crudely, of Trump supporters as rednecks or in pickup trucks in rural areas. That's not the profile of the Trump supporters who invaded the Capitol on January 6th. And that's what's so special and so difficult for us to get our arms wrapped around, because I think it's comfortable for us to think that the violent folks are just these fringes, as opposed to folks who could just be that insurrectionist next door.
Is Trump's rhetoric about the election, of course, touting the so-called big lie and that the election was stolen, is that the main source of what's sort of driving this level of political violence, or is that a symptom of something actually much deeper?
I would say that there are both deep sources and nearer-term sources, and these are not at odds. They kind of fit together. What we are seeing in our studies of the supporters of Trump on January 6th and also in our national surveys is that the violent support surrounding Donald Trump seems to go to the fear of the great replacement. The idea that there is demographic change happening in the country, but it's maliciously occurring. And this is where Trump's rhetoric comes in. Because what Trump is explaining, and others, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, a whole army on his side, are arguing is that this demographic change is not happening spontaneously, it's happening maliciously and for a malicious purpose to essentially subjugate a part of the population. Well, if you start to tell folks they're going to be subjugated, they're victims, this produces a very different reaction among people, and that's why you are seeing a large amount of not just support for Trump at the ballot box, but really dedicated and violent support for Trump.
As we get closer to the presidential election in the fall, is it inevitable that we will see sort of a rise in this threat?
No, I think that this would be easy for the public. The public, I think, is comfortable thinking the threat is either very high or very low permanently, when in fact the political prospects of Trump will have a lot to do with the level of the violent threat. So long as Trump is gaining at the ballot box, he's got very little to gain politically by orchestrating his followers to do any violence. And what we've seen over the last year is with the indictments and now the discussion of the 14th Amendment, Trump is soaring. Trump is soaring. So there could be a big change, however, when Trump no longer is soaring, is falling behind, and maybe loses. Those are the conditions under which, just like on January 6th, Trump may run out of political options to get ahead and may realize that violence is his only means, which he went to before.
Sort of a seesaw then. If Trump's not doing so well, then that threat of violence is likely to be higher.
That's an excellent way to put it. A seesaw, not a permanent state of either rising or falling. And this is why it's, I think, challenging for politicians, for the public, for community leaders to understand the political violence. Because I think that it's easier if we think of it as simply a linear phenomenon as opposed to something that could change in the period of just 2 or 3 weeks. An interesting fact, for instance, is that those small numbers of folks on January 6th who are Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, do you know when they joined, the folks who actually invaded the Capitol, who were in militia groups? Just 2 months before January 6th. These were not members of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys for years and years and years.
Sounds like something they signed up for late
after
in the game.
The election.
After the election.
The election happened. Trump is explaining to his people
that they had lost.
They had lost.
And they signed up.
And they signed up. And others who didn't sign up were also just as violent.
All right. So a lot to talk about, but we are out of time. Robert Pape, University of Chicago. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Up next, the latest on a policy that bans Chicago police officers from joining extremist groups. Stay with us. The ban on Chicago police officers belonging to extremist groups takes effect this weekend. Meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court takes a pass on the latest challenge to Illinois' assault weapons ban and why it took decades to prove former Alderman Ed Burke's corruption and abuse of power. Here with all that and more is our Spotlight Politics team, Amanda Vinicky, Heather Sharon, and Paris Schutz. Hello again, everyone. The gang's all here. So, as we said, starting Saturday, a policy that bans Chicago police officers from joining extremist groups takes effect. Heather, how is CPD going to implement or enforce this?
Well, this is really the crucial question, because it's one thing to have a policy on the books, and it's another thing to hold a Chicago police officer accountable for violating that policy. And if you ask Inspector General Deborah Witzberg, she says, look, there's already a policy on the books that says officers cannot bring disrepute to the department. And after your conversation with Robert Pape, if there's not something that brings disrepute to a law enforcement agency, then associating with groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, I am hard pressed to think of it. They have been unable to fire as many as a dozen police officers who have ties to those groups. Whether this policy, one of the first to be voted on and implemented by the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability, is very much an open question.
Paris, remind us why they passed this ban.
Well, remember, there was that kind of high-profile case of Officer Robert Baker. He was found to have ties, admitted to have ties to the Proud Boys, the extremist group whose leaders were convicted for their role in the January 6th insurrection. And as Heather said, it's very difficult to expel a police officer for a reason like this. So the Bureau of Internal Affairs did their investigation and said, look, we don't have grounds to fire. There were a couple other officers, as Heather mentioned. They came to the same conclusion. The IG, Deborah Witzberg, said, no. You got to look at this again. There are significant grounds to expel these officers. And so, City Council comes in and says, I guess we're just going to have to pass an ordinance here kind of defining this. But as you know, we've gone through these issues of police misconduct. There's the police board. There's how these things get adjudicated, and the police union, fights these things tooth and nail. And again, in these cases, they were clear cut. The officers had admitted or had documented their ties to groups like the Oath Keepers and the 3 Percenters and the Proud Boys.
Heather, speaking of course, the Police Oversight Board, as we mentioned, 7 permanent members of the commission will be selected for it. Who is qualified to serve on this?
So you have to have been a Chicagoan for 5 years, and you have to have some sort of expertise, either as a lawyer or a community organizer. The board also has to be balanced geographically. 2 members from the north, south, and west side at least, as well as 2 members younger than 24 to ensure that Chicago's youth has a voice on this commission. So it is very much an open question as to whether enough people will apply for these positions that the nominating committee and then Mayor Brandon Johnson can pick from. This is really a test of whether this new oversight structure that is designed to give real Chicagoans a say in how the police department operates, whether it works. We're approaching that critical moment.
I got to add in, there's like 400 hours of negotiating and legislating with aldermen to come to this kind of Frankenstein of a solution, because no one could agree on what this would look like. So they negotiated, and this kind of is what they came up with. And that's why, if it's complicated, that's why. It's sausage making.
If it's complicated, it's because it's complicated. Amanda, there's also this the statewide ban back in the headlines again. U.S. Supreme Court deciding against deciding to take a pass. I shouldn't say against, but the latest challenge to Illinois' assault weapons ban brought by State Representative Dan Calkins. What are he and others arguing?
Well, and so this is sort of a different attempt. And what is really crucial to understand is that this is likely not the end of the legal challenges for this law, including even before the U.S. Supreme Court. So Second Amendment challenges still remain. Calkins had tried to go another route, which is interesting as we're approaching an election in which there's an open seat for Cook County for a Supreme Court justice in Illinois, given that this case was decided by a 5-2 majority, including 2 new justices who had each received $1 million from Governor J.B. Pritzker, who, was a defendant in this case, given that he signed it into law. And so the challenge brought by Calkins had been, hey, my due process rights were violated. This is a court that doesn't they should have recused themselves from their case. It strikes at the independence of the judiciary if you're weighing in on a case from somebody from whom you've accepted donations. And so that was what, as you said, it's not that the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on those arguments, just that, as with so many cases, they said, we're going to take a pass and not hear it.
Yeah. Now that the registration requirement deadline has passed, it took effect July 1st, correct?
Or January 1.
January 1st, excuse me, I knew that. It took effect in a month that started with the letter J. How is it going, Amanda?
You know, it's not going great, presumably. We don't really have any way to know how many guns should be registered per the law, but we know that there are some 2.4 million void card holders, and a really tiny, like 1% of that, let's see, less than 30,000 individuals have registered. So we know that it's not going great. And now that the deadline has passed, there are a lot of unknown questions in terms of whether prosecutors are going to follow up on this at all, whether there will be any sort of compliance checks. And further, what happens if now that the deadline has passed, you say, oh gosh, I do have a gun that's supposed to be registered, and you file it, will you get in trouble? There's a meeting supposed to spell out rules after the deadline in the 16th.
The 16th. All right. I'm sure you'll tell us more once we figure that out. Of course, as we've covered, former Alderman Ed Burke convicted of 13 out of 14 counts of racketeering, bribery, and extortion. It all went down just before Christmas. But Heather, we know you've taken a closer look at this case. Why did accountability take so long?
Well, I really think that's the fundamental question that Chicagoans are left with after this really landmark verdict, because the tapes that we heard were Ed Burke sort of reflexively engaging in corruption whenever given the slightest opportunity, and that is why he is likely facing a lengthy prison sentence. My question is why was he allowed to operate that way? And I think that the really only question, the only answer to that is because that is the culture that Chicagoans were comfortable with, and how difficult it is to make these kind of cases. And I spoke with Constance Mixon, who testified in the Burke case, and she said, look, if it hadn't been for Danny Solis taking the prosecutors behind these closed doors, this probably never would have happened. So it is really sort of the fundamental issue is why he is the 38th alderman since 1969 to be convicted of corruption. And as the U.S. attorney said, the $64,000 question is, will this deter other politicians from engaging in similar conduct?
Just remember, think about,
folks, alder people were more angry at Danny Solis for quote-unquote ratting on Burke. And so, Heather, to answer your question, if there had been any other person in city council throughout those years, because they all knew what he was doing, he abstained from hundreds and hundreds of votes for a reason, because he had a conflict of interest, but we know that he influenced those votes. They all knew it. Had any of them gone to the feds earlier? And then there was also the Inspector General, Joe Ferguson, who was on him also for many years and who was a part of this case. So, and the last thing I'll say is Ed Burke was too smart. He was too quick for the feds until he wasn't.
And how much, let's also remember how much was caught on those tapes. Things that, frankly, surprised the feds. So at least snared a whole lot more, that is, than had been intentionally expected.
Yeah. Yes. All right, that's Spotlight, everybody. Amanda, Heather, Paris, thanks, gang. Up next, you're either for it or against it. Two kinds of people in this country. We explain the history of Dibs in Chicago. But first, a look at how soon you may have to claim that parking spot. So that predicted snowstorm, kind of more of a rainy mess today, but don't worry, you may be seeing some slushy snow outside right now, and we can expect more of the white stuff later in the week. When it comes to snow in Chicago, you can bank on it. See what we did there? And with snow in Chicago comes parking headaches, which of course means the return of Dibs. What exactly is Dibs? When did it start, and is it even legal? Those are among the questions we take on in the latest edition of our Emmy Award-winning series, WTTW News Explains. Here's Erica Gunderson.
Every winter, Chicago stands divided around a practice commonly known as dibs, when car owners use janky household objects to reserve their precious, shoveled-out parking spaces. The idea behind dibs is that digging your car out from the snow earns you exclusive rights to the spot. And should you decide to flout dibs and park in a space someone else has marked with a folding chair, dubiously acquired traffic cones, or a late Georgian Hepplewhite sideboard, there's an implicit threat that your car will pay the price. So how did dibs begin? Well, Chicago is among a handful of American cities that have the conditions to create a perfect storm for winter parking: high car ownership, a dense urban environment, and a snowy climate. Historic snowfalls in 1967 and 1979 were so catastrophic to Chicago's streets and shovelers' backs that folks began defending their spots with whatever junk was handy. Since then, hauling out the old milk crates or patio furniture after a hefty snowfall has become more or less standard practice in Chicago, much to the chagrin of others who find the practice petty and a little unneighborly. Though we're the biggest city to call dibs, we're not the only one. In Pittsburgh, it's known as the Pittsburgh parking chair. They also do it in Boston, but they probably call it the parking chair. And if the term dibs, which Chicago Tribune columnist John Cass coined in 1999, isn't cute enough for you, in Philadelphia, they call it savesies. Bottom line, is dibs legal in Chicago? Come on, it's not. Of course it's not. You know it's not. But when Mayor Richard M. Daley was asked his thoughts on dibs in 2001, he echoed the feelings of many Chicagoans.
If someone spends all their time digging that car out, do not drive into that spot.
So consider that fair warning, Chicago. Until a city leader has enough snowballs to enforce a no dibs policy, park in somebody else's dibs spot at your own risk.
I love hearing what other cities call it, savesies. If you're upset that you missed a chance to shovel out a spot today, you're in luck. Snow is back in the forecast on Friday. And visit our website for more in the WTTW News Explains series. We tackle your burning questions like why Chicago's pension debt is so high and what happens after you flush and everything in between. Well, not everything. That is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10 for Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm committed to giving back to the community through law and philanthropy.